All right, Katherine Brodsky, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So Katherine Brodsky, for those who don't know, is a writer, journalist, and media personality. And Katherine, you're known for your interviews with a bunch of different public figures, different actors, filmmakers, thinkers, innovators. And Katherine, your writing has appeared in publications including The Washington Post, The Guardian, Esquire, and others. Before we started recording, Katherine, you and I were talking about Israel-Palestine. Why is there so much polarization? Some people think that if you are pro-Israel, you are pro-genocide. Some people think that if you are pro-Palestine, you are pro-genocide. So what's going on?
Yeah, I think the well has been really poisoned in the discourse, and we see this in other controversial topics as well. It's like you can only be one or the other, and one, it's easier for people to paint the other side in some kind of a stereotypical, almost villain-like way, because then it's easier to attack. And I think also for the individuals themselves, I think a lot of times the nuance gets lost in the conversation because they're in defensive mode. Even with myself, as I was kind of mentioning to you, I don't post a lot about, the suffering of Palestinians, for example. It's not because I don't acknowledge it. It's not because I don't care. I do. I mean, I've wept over these things. I don't want to post about it because I'm like, I don't want people to be accused of this virtue signaling thing. But also, I think a big part of it for me is that there is sort of this existential threat. And, I post about Israel history and the situation a little bit more than a lot more than I do about Palestine, because I also think that there's a lot more people doing that for the Palestinian side, but also because I think for a lot of people, they take a side and defend it, and all that nuance, it creates doubt in their minds, right? Because if you acknowledge certain things on one side, you acknowledge other things on another side, well, then it becomes harder to view each side as the bad guy. And then it makes it harder to go against the bad guy. Also, I think extreme narratives just sell a lot more and they go more viral. And so you get that dopamine hit again, that applies to everything, not just this. And so it just reinforces this cycle where we are unable to have discourse, which I'm quite desperate to have, where it's not a debate, where it's a conversation where we're like learning from each other, testing our own ideas and thinking. And I think we'll never really arrive at any point of peace or conclusion if we don't talk to each other in a different way than we currently are.
You said that one of the reasons why you cover more of the pro-Israel narrative is because you feel like there is more coverage of the Palestinian narrative. Do you think that
it's funny because I listen to the Palestinian side and they say that the media is set against them and is biased against them. I listen to the pro-Israel side and they say that the media is set against them, is biased. So like, okay, who do you believe? Like my personal viewpoint is that it's quite not very pro-Israel. The idea that like it is captured by Zionists somehow is kind of silly. Even with, if you're going to point to certain Jewish people being in the media, well, Jewish people, there's plenty of really outspokenly, really hardcore pro-Palestinian Jewish people. So it's kind of a silly assertion. And we can kind of go back and forth who controls the media or who has more representation in the media a lot. I do think the protesters are not, when they get sort of more extreme in their actions, are not really helping the type of media coverage that they're gaining. But I think there's a lot of pro-Palestinian coverage, and there's some pro-Israel coverage as well. So I wouldn't say that the apparatus, you can make the argument that the U.S. sides with Israel, I guess, because they're an ally, which I suppose is true, though they also criticize it a lot for an ally,
Yeah. So you don't often, as you've said, post or speak about things from the the point of view of like what we call pro-Palestine. So if I asked you right now, to steelman the Palestinian cause, or to offer one point of criticism of Israel, in a nutshell, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, I can go extensively because I think there's a lot of things worth of criticizing. I think for me, like the settlements are a big contentious point. I also understand. I mean, I think sometimes the criticism when we say, "Oh, there's no such thing as a Palestine," not we say, I don't say that, but like there are people who are pro-Israel who will say there's no such thing as Palestinians, which is, well, technically the term Palestinian only started getting used during Arafat's reign, so it was sort of a political movement. But I think it's unfair to say, well, these people do. I mean, the Palestinian side of it usually would say, well, we have our own unique culture that had developed by living in this region through the community in this region, and it is a distinct one. And I would never want to deny that for them. So, we can quibble about terms, but ultimately, I think they have the right to say, well, even though they're Arabs, initially, they're a subset, I suppose. And if they want to call themselves Palestinians, so be it. And then I think, in terms of the land, I mean, now I'm going into, I can go into a whole steel manning thing. I mean, I think when it comes to the debate over the land, I think the Palestinian view would be, well, even though we didn't have, it was the Ottoman Empire, even though we didn't have this land, as sort of this recognized entity, the way that they might see themselves as a culture that doesn't need that, right? They define themselves differently, and therefore they still feel like they had ownership of that region. Whereas the more, let's say, pro-Zionist viewpoint would be, well, this belonged to the Ottoman Empire. They negotiated it, when they lost World War I, it ended up becoming a British Empire mandate, sorry. And so it was up to the British to be able to give that land and divide it as they chose.
The point about the term Palestinian, when it originated, I think the way you spoke to that idea, I think was very well said and eloquent, because I have heard that argument before, that the idea that the notion of Palestinian is new and therefore they don't have a legitimate claim to their culture or heritage. I'm not an expert in this. I think there is a semantic truth to the origin of the term, but to use that semantic truth to then try to diminish, the history of a people, I think is terrible. And I think that's, like, unfortunately, done sometimes.
Yeah, and I see that being done to, Ashkenazi Jews, for example, in somewhat of a similar way. So I don't particularly like that, and I try to push back against that. And I mean, we can talk, there's certainly injustices that happen. Israel is by no means a perfect nation. No nation is perfect. So of course, in the course of a war, there's going to be war crimes because some people are going to commit war crimes. I think the checkpoints, while I understand why Israel does them, because that's their way of fighting violence, and I welcome other alternatives, the checkpoints, I'm sure some are friendly and some are not. I mentioned to you that sometimes when I've gone through security myself and not being Palestinian, it hasn't been a pleasant experience. So I completely believe that the interactions between, Palestinians trying to just go to work might not be great interactions. And if it's the only interaction that they've had with an Israeli, well, maybe not the ones going to work because they have other interactions. But, if they're going from a particular region within the West Bank, for example, to another region, if that's the interaction they have on a daily basis or frequently enough, they might feel a certain kind of way. And I can understand that. And I think Israel needs to have a really professional standard that's, respects human dignity, where people are trained in a way where they are really respectful. I think settlements are obviously a really contentious issue because ultimately it makes peace more difficult, and I understand there are attacks by settlers. I'm sure it kind of goes both ways, but I certainly believe there are settlers who might initiate the violence for no reason because they're terrible people. Some people are terrible people. I don't mean all settlers.
Yeah. What do you think is the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict? What's going to happen?
Okay, so I have, if I had it my way, have thought about this, and well, I do think that Hamas needs to be removed from power because you can't really do anything until they are. I would say that my steps would be sort of a de-radicalization, like what has been done with Germany and Japan. So that does mean an occupation of sorts for a period of time. I don't think Israel should be the occupier. I think it should be some kind of an international group with, multiple countries, and especially with, I think Arab countries need to be involved in that. So that is about more overhauling the radical, the schooling and the structures. And I think I would do a carrot kind of incentive where if there's no violence for some time, they get more and more and more freedom. And you set a certain period of time that would be a definite period of time during which they earn, ultimately complete independence as a state. So that would be and I actually don't think there would be, if, for example, 10 years or whatever amount of time makes sense, there's zero violence. I don't see why we couldn't then be comfortable with them having every single right that any other country has. That's my view. Maybe there's a lot to challenge there. I'm happy to hear that. And I think we need to have more Palestinians who want peace, but who are also representative of the people on the ground, not exceptions, kind of in the conversation, providing their feedback.
Yeah. And hopefully we can find a way to get to peace. So, different topic, cancel culture and free speech. You've written and spoken and posted a lot about cancel culture and free speech. How have your views changed in the last 12 months when it comes to free speech and cancel culture?
Yeah. I mean, so I've had, my whole journey started with a cancel culture experience of my own, but I was seeing it actually started before that. I think I realized the extent of it more after my own experience. So I was seeing people being canceled for the smallest things that, maybe I agreed with or disagreed with. It doesn't matter. It's like they weren't things that were worthy of destroying somebody's life. And I saw that the punishment was always the same, regardless of the crime. Somebody could have just said something wrong. I'm sure on this very podcast, I've already blundered a few times and, it could get canceled, right? So it's like, and I mean, well, ultimately, and I'm happy to, I have really good intentions, but people don't care about that. So, having had my own experience, and I'll save people the time of going into it, but
I actually don't know what you're referring to.
Know.
If you're willing to tell me about it.
Sure. I'll do Cole's notes of it. So I ran a group on Facebook for jobs. It was an offshoot of another group for women journalists, media people. And my particular group was just focused on jobs because I thought, well, that's what people want. So I made this group. I had about 30,000 members. And then somebody posted a job opening at Fox News. And people just started piling on and calling her all sorts of things and targeting this person. And since it was my group, I thought, well, I need to say something. I'm the person who is responsible for it. So I just stepped in and I initially just said, look, let's stay away from politics in the group and personal attacks, and let's come together rather than apart. There's been too much division as is. I thought it was a pretty PC post, but people didn't agree. And
sorry, what was wrong with you? Sorry. What was wrong with you saying that?
Well, apparently that made me a white supremacist, and I'd just as soon let the KKK recruit, and all sorts of things like that were thrown at me. because I'm taking politics out of a group that's already inherently political by virtue of being open to women. My group was open to women because I was in this other group and I just wanted to do an offshoot of it that was for jobs. It wasn't, I didn't have any political inclinations there. So people really went crazy on me. Which at first I was I engaged with everyone and I thought, well, maybe they have a point. Maybe I'm missing something here. And it got worse and worse. And people started, threatening to go to my editors so I never work again. And it just escalated even more because I said, well, if you think by virtue of this group being open to women, it has to be political. Well, I don't want it to be political. So I'll open it up to men and give you guys, a month to leave if you want to leave. If you want to form another group, I'll promote it. You guys can even have the original name of the group. That I think provoked much more outrage, even more outrage. And at that point, I was getting people sending me images of mobs with torches and saying we have long memories. People were writing articles, slamming me. They were harassing me on social media, doxing me, all this crazy stuff, which now I kind of look back at and I'm like, wow, over that. But at the time, first of all, I'm not a confrontational person. I might have become more over the past 3 years or so, but I'm like a people pleaser naturally. And so having that thrown at me in this kind of extreme way was really, really emotionally difficult and nearly broke me.
Yeah.
And
sounds hard.
Again, yeah. And again, I was like, maybe I'm wrong, right? I never had that certainty. And I got a different perspective when I realized, look, even if I disagreed with myself, or somebody with my views, how would I behave? And I would never behave in the way that these people did. And that was a big lesson for me because I learned, well, you know what? If I'm going to listen to someone, I'm going to always listen to people who come in good faith if they disagree with me. Totally, always. But when somebody just threatens you, calls you names and all sorts of things like that, then they're not coming in good faith. They're not people that you should take seriously because they are people I don't respect them. They immediately lose my respect when they engage in that way. And that was a big shift for me because previously I engaged with everyone. That was my belief. That has shifted. Now I use blog buttons more liberally and so on. But also in all of this, as this was happening, there's a few types of messages I was getting. I was getting messages of support from people who literally said to me, look, I feel so ashamed. I see what's happening to you, but I'm too afraid to speak up. And I was getting quite a few of those messages almost exactly the same way. And then I was getting messages of just people sharing their experiences. And so that really shifted something in me, that whole experience. And that led me to ultimately, I wrote a book called No Apologies, How to Find and Free Your Voice in the Age of Outrage, which was, a lot of stories about people undergoing similar circumstances, but showing how that can suppress free exchange of ideas in fields like science, climate science, in tech, in art. And art is so crucial. You have to be able to play, and sometimes say things that are offensive. And I think intent matters a lot. If you're just intending to hurt someone and there is not to make a point, but to hurt someone, that's one thing versus, you're exploring something and you happen to mutter something that maybe didn't come out right. Maybe 5 minutes later, you're not going to think that again. You've changed your mind, especially if somebody says to you, well, here's why you're wrong. Right. But again, we treat everything sort of the same. And then around the same time, I'm noticing there's such a suppression of speech even legally that's going on. So on the one hand, we have people who are just afraid to speak openly on really important topics because they're afraid of the backlash. They are afraid of being destroyed. So we don't really know what anybody's thinking. Once I started speaking more openly to people, I realized like a lot of people have very similar views to mine, or maybe even really different views to mine. But there isn't this like consensus that's being dictated by the radical fringes of each side. And I think also what changed for me is that, originally I didn't know anybody conservative, to be honest. Okay, or barely knew anybody. So I wasn't in that realm. And so I started getting to know people who were on the right. And I was like, okay, well, they don't seem to be as racist or homophobic as I've been told, which, I was always open to talking to people, but it was just, they weren't in my circle. So I think some of the stereotypes, they get imprinted on you. Now, I've been around, a lot of these people supported free speech because they were the ones being oppressed, because I think that the institutions are more left-leaning overall. And so media, education, academia, those kinds of institutions are definitely more left-leaning. And so a lot of the oppression was on either people who are on the right, as well as people on the left who were sort of more heterodox thinkers. Like my book is mostly cases of people on the left being suppressed. Bless you. And bless you again. And the reality of it is that what I've been noticing happening over the last year or more is that the same people who are sort of advocating for free speech, once they started gaining power, and they were anti-cancel culture as well, they started weaponizing it in the same way that I saw the left doing it. And I've always said, and people get mad at me over this, because as soon as I both side it, people are like, no, this side is far worse and this side is far worse. And no matter who I'm talking to, that's what they end up doing. But the reality is it's human behavior. It's human nature. And if people don't adhere to principles, it doesn't matter which side you're on. You're going to betray those principles at some point. And you can't say, well, we need to do this until we get our power back. And then we're going to go back and be these noble individuals who adhered to principles. No, you gave them up.
I want to double click into your story and rewind a bit, actually. And maybe I should have asked these questions at the beginning when you were describing it. But can you just take us to the beginning of the story? And I'm unclear about a couple details. So what was the situation? Where were you working?
It was just a group. I was actually just, it was a voluntary thing. So I just created, I have a couple of groups that I created a long time ago. There were job boards. And it was just on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And actually, I mean, we had a job board and it had a mentorship program in there as well. It was actually mentioned in the New York Times. It was, pretty.
So you created a job board. Mm-hmm. And someone posted what was the post that someone made that was?
It was just a job opening at Fox News. And she was very apologetic too. She's like, I know it's Fox, but you're trying to diversify our workforce and
Right. And so then you had this job posting at Fox on your job board and you said, like, let's stay away from politics or something? What was that in response?
I said that because that person who made that post started getting attacked. There were a lot of comments just personally, viciously attacking
against Fox?
Because they see Fox. Well, yeah. So the people, some of the people in the group, they see Fox as, this almost fascist entity, right? And so to them, it's the villain in the story. So
right. And so you said, hey, this is Fox News is just a news outlet. Like if they want to post a job opening, let them do it. Let's stay away from politics.
Well, I don't think that anybody should be telling people where or they should post job opportunities, because if you talk to Republicans, they think MSNBC is the most horrible propaganda outfit that's destroying their country, and people on the left feel that way about Fox News. So
Yeah.
why am I supposed to decide, we should allow MSNBC but not Fox, or vice versa?
Mhm.
It's just not. I mean, LinkedIn
Right.
doesn't do that.
So where's the part where you were canceled? I must have
It
missed
was the
something.
part that post. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous story that I think it confuses people a little
Yeah.
bit,
No,
because
but tell me again. So
yeah.
what was the thing that you did or said that got you canceled?
The thing that I said was the post that I made. So what started it was the
Yeah.
post that I made about saying, well, let's stay away from discussing politics and personal attacks.
And but that was in regards to like you weren't defending someone's racist statement. You were
No,
saying, "Hey, you should be able to post a job opening
correct.
at Fox News."
Correct.
So where were you canceled? What was the thing you did or said that got you like quote
That
unquote
was the
canceled?
thing that started it.
Allowing a job posting
Yeah.
for Fox. So then who were the
Yeah.
people that were canceling you?
Just random people who are members of the group. And I think
Is
it's
the
important to recognize that, because once people left the group, it was only about 2% of the group. They're just really vocal. So I think we sometimes feel like everyone's out against us,
yeah.
but really it's a small group of people.
How big was this job board group thing that you made?
30,000 members.
Holy shit. Okay. So now, okay. So when I think in job board, I wasn't realizing the scale. Wow. And when you say canceled, like what did that mean practically? What does that mean, canceled in this case?
Well, it was an attempted cancellation, I would say.
Yeah.
So the idea was, they downvoted my content.
Yeah.
They
meaning
reached out to
Democratic, liberal.
different people
Yeah.
in that group who would have been left leaning.
But these are the people against you were people who hate Fox News. So people
Correct.
who are Democratic, liberal oriented
Yeah.
folks who hate Fox News because Fox News is so hateful. This is the irony. This is why I have this belief. My new belief is that the problem with the polarization in this country and the problem with why we all hate each other, it's just the extremes on both sides, and their rhetoric is very similar to each other. So what?
I said extremely so, yeah.
So I won't name names, but I spoke with someone at some point within the last few months who identifies as very, very left-leaning liberal and hates people who are conservative, right-wing, but this individual's rhetoric matches almost identically what you would expect from the right-wing conservatives that this person supposedly hates. It's the same. I think that people on extremes on either end have the same type of hate. If you're very, very left, you hate the people on the right, and if you're very, very right, you hate the people on the left. And there's an irony here. Like there's an irony to how similar. There's a similar emotional thing going on.
And they're unable to look at themselves in the mirror because ultimately, even though they criticize the other side for engaging in the exact same behavior, to them, they are justified because they're on the right side. They're the good guys. And and so it's the same on both sides. And again, this is why I advocate, I try to stay away from ideology. Like I have my own, worldview, and it is what it is. I'm not going to convince somebody else to take my worldview or my ideology. But what I do try to focus on when I do public speaking in my writing is that I want people to focus on the behaviors as opposed to the ideology. I'm not going to make somebody who's a Republican a Democrat or vice versa. Nor do I want to. It's up to them. But I do want people to be able to say, look, these kinds of behaviors are unacceptable. I think also cancel culture, I can't definitively say, well, no one should ever get canceled, right? And I think this becomes really difficult because you're like, well, at which point? What's the exact point that somebody should be? But I think that line should be pretty high. And I think at least to start with, we need to give people more grace. And that's more what I advocate for.
I don't think it's, I think if there's a safe amount of ambiguity as to whether this person meant something malicious by what they said. I mean, when you're allowing a post from Fox. I'm very confused by the story. How people would get so angry at you for saying that Fox News should be allowed to post a job opening. By the way, the irony here is that if Democratic liberals want to change the media or hate Fox News, the best thing to do is go work for Fox News.
Right.
Like, that's the best thing to do. Like, give Fox News
So there you're not going to get
liberal...
many people taking that up on the
right,
left.
but like if you think that an organization is leaning too far to one side, then go work for them if they'll hire you, and which they might, and that's how you would make change. It's not by adding to your own echo chamber; it's by influencing the others. So so one of the questions I initially asked before you told the story was, how have your views changed as it relates to cancel culture and free speech?
I mean, mostly I think I saw that as being something on the left. I think initially, because first of all, I was in a left-leaning bubble. So I was seeing these behaviors as being pretty much exclusively to left because, people on the right were seen as preaching for free speech, no cancel culture, all of that stuff. And then I saw how quickly that could change. And if you look historically, the right used to cancel people. I mean, the McCarthy era is all right wing and it was brutal. So I think, it just changes according to who has the power. And so that was quite a significant shift for me. And I think that is why I focus so much more these days on not pointing the finger one side or the other side, but much more so on the behaviors that I'm witnessing. So that was a big shift for me. I think free speech is, I think I had a more noble view of free speech. So I've always been all about free speech. And I still am, I very much believe in the importance of defending it. What I've seen as a problem is how, a lot of the people so when people would say, I'm pro free speech, people on the left would immediately jump at them, said, oh, you're pro saying the N-word, right? And I would always be sort of appalled by that logic because I'm like, this is ridiculous. I've personally never said the N-word in my life, nor do I have any kind of desire to, just not even on my mind. But I want us to be able to discuss ideas. And I viewed that as being what most people want when they say that. Unfortunately, I am seeing a lot of people absolutely using that as a veneer and using that to spew hatred. I still don't believe in, silencing hate speech, certainly not on a government level, right? I don't think people should be going to jail for that unless they're inciting violence or something like that. That's a different thing. But I think with social media, I am quite concerned about where we're going with this because we can just look statistically, and there's a bunch of studies on this, that fake things get amplified a lot more. We see, somebody actually making a tweet about just, using the N-word and that exploding and all these horrible things. And so I'm thinking, okay, how do we counteract some of this stuff without resorting to censorship? So I've been thinking a lot about, in particular, I'm much more concerned, I would say, about fake information being spread. So that's a big part of it for me. So things like community notes on X, and I think Facebook or another entity is coming out with something similar. I think that's a really good way forward. I think AI could be a really effective tool for just fact checking factual things, right? I think the idea of truth is under attack. I see people as like, oh, there's no truth, right? So on the left, there's like, it's my truth, right? But on the right, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, well, there is no truth because everybody's lying to you. I don't agree with that. I think we can assess truth. And I think also people confuse opinion with factual information. Factual information is something that can be verified. Truth to me is something that maybe it's an approximation of truth. We might not know things 100%. And for example, if we have a mass consensus in society, let's say about something in science, well, at certain points, consensus has been proven wrong, but it's the exception, right? So we can have a good general grasp of that. That's probably true. But factual things, that's something I can say, well, did it rain yesterday? And I can verify that. Did the wars of whatever start in this year? And I can verify this. So I think things like that are easily verifiable. I think we can use tools like AI to do that in real time immediately before that just spreads. And, AI has a hallucination problem. So, people can also vote that down as something that needs to go through a human verification, because they can say, well, this is a hallucination, and there could be tiers. But I think it is important for companies to sort of focus on that so my main emphasis is like, we don't censor information. We provide more information, and then people can make up their minds for themselves and decide, you know what, this doesn't make sense. I don't trust this, or I'm going to go and take an extra step and verify this for myself, or not. But I think that probably does need to happen.
Do you know where the line is between, you said you're not exactly sure when we should censor speech, but there is a line, right? Like there's some speech that's not productive, it's designed.
Well, I said
to
I'm not
harm.
sure when we should cancel people, but in terms of
yeah. When should we censor speech then?
Well, I personally don't think we should censor speech, with the exception of speech that is leading to violence. So that's my, I am closer to being a free speech absolutist. That said, platforms are different from the outside world, right? Like the idea of free speech, the First Amendment, is about protection from the government. And ultimately, the intent of it was really more about being able to criticize the government than just saying anything. But, there is studies that show that sometimes when you suppress even hate speech, it can actually result in more violence. So I think it's important to look at, okay, what's the consequences of suppressing speech? And also the idea of hate speech is so debatable. Somebody might say, calling somebody a male who is trans is hate speech. And some people will agree with that, and some people won't agree with that. And there isn't like a consensus. And so that's a really difficult thing to determine. And we see that in countries like Ireland, Canada, the UK, they have really restrictive speech laws. But now that's different from a platform. And a platform should be able to decide for itself, free of government interference, how they want to moderate. So, for example, X, Elon, he has certain terms of service. They're not really being enforced, or they're being randomly enforced, I guess is the case. Even if he did away with all of them, I think it's his right. Now, would it be a good user experience? I think a lot of people would say it's not a good user experience, right? It's 4chan. Most normal, sane people don't really spend a lot of time on 4chan. So people do seem to appreciate some level of moderation. And maybe there's levels of, I've sort of advocated for choose your own adventure kind of. So if I went on X and I don't want to see all the really, really horrible things, or maybe I have a higher tolerance for that. And I should be able to set so this stuff isn't constantly bombarding me. Or maybe you give people trustworthiness ratings. Now that starts sounding a little like a social credit system. So, we want to be careful with that. But I think we should be thinking about how we, algorithms right now are generally designed on every platform to amplify whatever is the most extreme. And people tend to engage with content that's most extreme. So they look at, interactions. But it doesn't mean that people don't get value from things that are not extreme. And you see there's really popular science podcasts, or, beautiful dance on TikTok. You have all these beautiful dances or whatever. I think there should be other ways to deal with the algorithm so that it doesn't just elevate the content that's the most extreme and recognizes content that other people acknowledge as being maybe useful. Maybe that's the metric. Is this useful? Does this add value to me in some way?
That makes sense. Is it helpful? Does it add to understanding? Earlier today on Twitter, you posted, if you asked the question, if If you could get one question answered, any question, what would it be? So let me pose that question to you, Katherine. If you could get one question answered, any question, what would it be?
Gosh, that might take me some time to think. I didn't think I wanted to know other people. I often ask the questions that I do because I'm trying to inform my own thinking. What would it be? Gosh, that's a really good question, Jake.
Well, I didn't come up with it myself. So,
I mean, for me, I'll kind of turn the question into something a little different. There's a question that I like to ask myself all the time, and that's a guiding question for me. And I apply that to everything I do. And that question is, what is useful? So, it stops me. For example, sometimes I'll read somebody's post and it's just this awful thing. And I want to react. I'm a human being, I'm like, oh, I want to yell at them, It's not like that doesn't exist in me. But then I'll pause and I'm like, okay, what's the most useful way for me to approach this? If I just call this person a racist or whatever, or an anti-Semite, what does this do? It's not going to do anything positive. It's not going to change them. It's actually probably going to have a negative consequence, if anything. And it's not going to be useful. So either I don't engage. Sometimes I choose to just not engage and walk away. And other times I might be like, okay, it might be useful for me to give this person this context and kill them with kindness, So in general, that's how I write or try to write. That's how I try to interact with people. So I'd love to, if I could have that question answered in every area, I would like that question to be answered because that would help me guide myself better.
What question?
What is most useful?
What is most useful? So in terms of, so the question you want answered is, in a given context, what is you don't have a specific question, what's the meaning of life? It's more of like, in a given context, you want to know what's the most useful thing to do? Like what can you do that's going to have a result that you want it to have, not just what do you want to do?
Exactly. And if we're going to take it back to and apply to the Israel-Palestine conflict, I guess my question would be, what is the solution that would lead to the most maximum happiness and peace for both groups of people? That would be my question. I would love that answer. I wish we spent more time talking about that than trying to, debate who's wrong or who's right, which ultimately won't bring us to anything that's like a particularly helpful resolution.
Yeah.
In my view.
Yeah. Yeah, getting to a solution. So your book, No Apologies, tell me about that. What is the book about? What's the message that you want readers or listeners to know about from this book?
I think the main thing that I wanted to get across is how when we allow the very loud, radical minority, and I want people to understand that it's a minority, to take charge of all our narratives, of our speech, of what we do, we basically give that over to them. Do we really want these small groups of people to control the world and the countries that we live in? And we can see throughout history where, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, for example, is an example cited in the book. That isn't something where it was like a huge group of people wanting to get involved. It was a small group of people and they took charge. Most people didn't care or had contrary views. So I see that as what's happening in the world today. And in the context of cancel culture, what I see is a lot of people being really afraid. And I get it because I was really afraid. But a lot of people being so afraid to say anything, to push back, to voice their opinions, to voice their honest opinions. And so we let a very small group of people who are quite radical and intimidating to dictate everything. And in the book, I use the different stories of the people that I've interviewed, as well as sharing my own. But, I try to share other people's stories who had not all of them have been canceled, by the way. I'll just I'll make a note of that. Some of the people I feature in the book, like Daryl Davis and John Patrick Shanley, they're not like people have been necessarily targeted in any meaningful way by cancellations. Although Daryl kind of has. He got called a white supremacist, which, if you know anything about Daryl, so absurd because he's, basically a black man who grew up in the civil rights era and was an activist. So it's just shows you the absurdity of this. But it's something that, I also wanted to show through these stories, how these people dealt with it. And I want to be honest about it because it does have a toll. Like, it's not like not every story is like a feel good, you come out in the end. Though I think that every person who made the decision to stand by their principles, I think felt really good about that. And they felt like they couldn't do it any other way. And I also wanted to show how that influences the different spheres with which they operate. And those are really important ones. Academia is really important because that's where we should be debating ideas, including like stupid ideas, that we need to get that out. Actually, if you never voice, say I have a stupid, let's decide it's a stupid thought. Say I think something where I'm really wrong. If I never say it out loud, I never have a chance to be corrected. And I have been corrected in my life, and I've changed my point of view because I've gotten more information from someone. I never have that opportunity if I never said that wrong thing. And in academia, it's incredibly important. In science, we definitely see this consensus culture that's really problematic because, the scientific method is all about challenging things. And you don't have to agree with the conclusions of the people in the book at all, right? I don't agree with some of them. But I think what's important is that if you don't allow good faith speech to happen and research, then you might miss something really important and something that's important for us. So, some of the cases that I looked at are climate change, for example. The people that I interviewed weren't even, it's not like they're climate science deny, like they're not saying there's nothing happening, but just a slight dissent can have sort of the mob come after them. And it makes it really difficult to discuss things in a way where perspectives can be tested or research can be tested appropriately, even if it was to debunk all of that, right? Which is important too, because if they believe it, so do many other people. And so I think it's important for people to see things debunked as well. And they will never see them debunked if people can't say what they actually think.
Yeah. In your book, like who is this minority group that's dictating the speech that you're referring to? You gave the example of what happened in China, but you're saying now that there's this minority group that is canceling people. Like what is that group? Who are they?
Well, I mean, so one thing that's also important, I guess, to mention is I was born in the Soviet Union. So I think my views of things are a bit informed by that and particularly my parents' experience. So I think the idea of speech being controlled or groupthink has always been something on my radar. When I wrote the book, obviously because I was in the ecosystem of the left, and also it was at the height of the cancellation period, right? Because 2020, 2021. So my attempted cancellation, I call it, because I don't know if I've full on canceled, but like 2021 was like one of the worst years for that in 2020. Probably the pandemic didn't help, but I think that it was something that, at that time, it was the left doing the canceling. And when I wrote the book, my intention was, as somebody who's more on the left, was to speak to my own people. Like, I believe in don't move houses, like clean your own house, right? Yeah. And I think it's a responsibility for anybody, whatever their political side is. If you're not happy with how people are behaving or what they're advocating on your side, work to improve that. So I was trying to reach out to people who I saw as being on my side, um, and wanting them to understand the scale of the problem, and also wanted to empower them to speak. Because I've noticed that when I spoke, it helped other people speak. It's almost like gave other people permission if you go first. And so I wanted other people to go first as well, so that it could have that ripple effect. And I think to some extent we've moved that along a little bit, maybe not to the extent that I wish, but I think people are getting tired. I'm talking about people on the left. I think they are getting tired of being, of the over the top reactions, of not being free. Like if you look at art, for example, cinema has been so sanitized. TV is a little bit more wild, but even TV, I have friends who work in writers' rooms, and they're afraid because there would be like this one person who'd complain about a joke that's like they'll deem inappropriate, and they'll get the writer fired. So that creates a space where people can't, it's not a safe space, right? People can't play with ideas. It's one thing if you're like just trying to insult people. And it's another thing if you're trying to write a joke. And often the characters in movies or shows, they're not like puritanical, which is really, it's this in some ways is a puritanical movement, which is crazy, very anti-liberal.
What's driving it?
I think in some ways there's a victimhood aspect to it. I think when victims get power, they behave in this way. That's like, it's like when it's been done to them. Like, I think they've legitimately had, there's racism, there's oppression that they may have experienced at certain points. But when they gain power, they tend to use that power against others. That's why I'm seeing like the conservatives who feel like they've been victimized now. That's why I think they're behaving in the way that they are. So I think that's part of it. I think academic, and I know less about this, but the academia, I think there are certain ideas within it that have been pushed in by other entities. Like I know Qatar invests heavily, Russia. I don't know the extent of Russian involvement, but I think there is some. There's evidence to show that there is some. And in general, like when I went to school, very liberal faculty, studied communication. My teachers who were pretty leftist, it was okay to talk about things, and and freedom of speech was something so fundamentally left leaning at the time, right? And now it's switched, and I do think maybe at the crux of it is this idea of like, the left only gotten that power at a certain point. Now they have the power, and I think anybody with power has a tendency to then use that power in these ways, especially when they view themselves through the lens of a victim.
So it's the people in power. How can it be that it's the people in power who are the victims, though? It seems like a paradox.
Well, they don't view themselves as necessarily the power because they've recently attained that power, right? So I think they view themselves still as being sort of victims, right? Who now have power. It seems to be, it's like this idea, I think I brought this up before, where like my dad was, he had to have military training at some point, and he said that they would do a hazing ritual to the newcomers, and those were this is the Soviet Union, and they were pretty brutal and humiliating, and instead of being like, okay, I was victimized by this, don't want to do that to other people, the attitude was more like, oh, great, now I get to do it, right? And I think that comes from that kind of psychological aspect. And other people have like really radically different theories to me than what I'm saying, but to me that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Final question is, what do you think is the question that everyone should think about in order to question their own beliefs? Like if you feel staunchly Republican or Democrat or on a certain side of the issue, how do you make sure that you're not victim to your own biases and that you're thinking rationally? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, I do. I think what I try to do is can you steel man the other side, right? I think that always has to be, because, and can you criticize your own? So like, let's say, a lot of people say that MAGA people are in a cult. Okay. I think some people are, but I think the way that you verify that versus like somebody, just having rational reasons for supporting Trump, let's say, is like, okay, can you criticize the person? What things about Trump would you criticize? If they're able to do that, usually they're not in a cult. And can they say something that they like about Democrats? And then you do the same thing to people who are Democrats. But for anything, any topic, you have to, for me, I always I try to find holes because I want to be more sure of my position, right? First of all, I tried not to take a position immediately. I tried to just put down the facts, not try to, because I think what people tend to do, and apparently smarter people do that even more, which is why smart people often believe crazy things, is that they're really good at convincing themselves. If they take a position, then they can piece things together that fit, right? And this is very kind of, I guess, conspiratorial thinking comes into that. But if you just try to start from a neutral position and also acknowledge any biases that you do have, try to disprove yourself. Don't do it with other people because you're going to then reflexively take a defensive position because you want to win. Just do it with yourself. Be honest with yourself and just look up at the information, poke holes at your own beliefs, and try to steelman another position. You're still going to, like, I'm not going to be like, man, both positions on Russia and Ukraine are equally valid. I can obviously I'm going to take a particular position on this. But, I absolutely would have tried to find the best possible. And don't look for, when you're doing that research, because I think one of the problems that we have is like people will just point at the worst representatives. I try to find the best people, like the people that I think are the smartest, the most honest, the most accurate. Those are the people I'm going to look to try and counter my views and learn from.
Like John Mershmer. No?
I have listened. So, I mean, I don't agree.
Yeah. I'm saying he's a smart, you're not going to agree, but
he's not an idiot. Sure.
He's a
so
smart,
that's fair. Yeah. Yeah. He's knowledgeable, at least on the history and so on.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for your time. This was awesome. Talking about all these topics. I'm going to end the recording and then maybe we could wrap up for a couple of minutes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.